Welcome to my lesson on, in my opinion, the most difficult opponent type to play against, loose aggressives. In your time, you will encounter many players who think they are loose aggressives, but in truth are just bad aggro donkeys. This lesson, however, is geared towards the loose aggressives that actually know what they're doing and have a steady win rate. As you go higher in stakes, most of your opponents will be loose aggressive, and believe me, they are a handful. I can't guarantee the following advice will make you able to beat them, but at least you'll be able to hold your own. In a full ring setting, loose aggressives or lags will have a VPIP of 18 or up and a preflop raise of 14 and up. These numbers can go as high as 30 in some cases, but anything above 30 in a full ring setting would typically be a sign of a bad player. Their aggression will of course be quite high at 3 or greater. In shorthanded, their VPIP will typically be 33 and up with a preflop raise of 28%. Yes, they play a ton of hands, but they're able to play so many hands because they play so well after the flop. So here are the strengths of loose aggressives. First, they are fearless and willing to put their stack in at any time if they think they have the best of it. This means they will put a ton of pressure on you, and they are able to do this because through betting patterns and even timing tells, loose aggressives can do a great job of reading your hand and figuring out where they stand against you. Next, loose aggressives know when their fold equity is high, when their opponent's probably missed, and when it's a good time to try and pick up the pot with any two cards. In short, they're betting in optimal situations for betting. Lags are relentless. Sometimes when I'm playing them, I feel like I don't even have a second to breathe. They're constantly pounding, and their smart aggression, as I like to call it, is extremely difficult to play against. Lastly, even though I've stated they only bet when it's smart to, most players don't just assume that lags are just bluffing lunatics and play back at them without thought. This means the lag gets action when he has a big hand and can stand the heat. It's really quite a deadly combination, especially because lags tilt the hell out of most tight players, and a lot of tight players adjust incorrectly, and that's why we have this lesson, so you guys won't suffer the same fate as so many nits have. Weaknesses. We all have weaknesses, so without further ado, here are the lag soft spots. Since they're playing a ton of hands and stabbing at so many pots, they'll have nothing a lot of the time. It's our job to recognize when they're betting because they have a made hand or just because it's a good spot. If it turns out it is just a good spot, we're going to throw a counter left hook to deal with all those jabs they've been throwing at us. Against many lags, they have issues with slowing down. Their foot is always on the gas pedal. They assume passive is weakness, and if you can play a proper, smart passive style, you can trap these guys for a decent amount of value. You aren't going to stack them by trapping, but you are going to win a lot of medium-sized pots if you pot control properly and kind of throw them off the rhythm. When playing a loose aggressive is one of the very few times I would advocate moving from an aggressive style to a passive style. Remember that to get the max value in poker, you want to be playing the style opposite to that of your opponent, or in a tournament or in a bigger table setting, you want to be playing opposite to the style that the table is playing to win the maximum. Lags like to keep their opponents honest, and they're willing to make big calls for a lot of chips with as little as ace high. If you can get in the head of your opponent and do some wacky stuff, you can get a ton of value because they simply won't understand what the fuck you're doing. Against these opponents, we have to learn to be very creative, and that's why so many people have difficulty playing against them. The last leak lags have is that if they open a pot, they hate giving it up. if they defend their opens way too wide, in my opinion, even if they find themselves out of position. Typically, if a loose aggressive raises and he gets re-raised, he is going to call a large percentage of the time, even if it's a tight re-raiser. This is the one real weakness we can get a ton of value from, simply because they're willing to play out of position, and position is such a big advantage in no limit hold'em. So let's go straight to the adjustments now that you have your lag cheat sheet. The first adjustment goes with our last weakness, that lags defend their opens too light. To take advantage of the fact that they're opening too many hands, and the fact that they should fold a lot of these hands when we re-raise them, we want to re-raise them with both our premium hands and our speculative hands to put a ton of pressure on them. Dealing with 3-bets out of position is one of the hardest things to do in no limit hold'em, so that's what we have to throw at lags. The reason we 3-bet with suited connectors here is that usually a C-bet will win the pot, or will give up if they check raise our C-bet, and we won't have to show down, so it doesn't matter what we have. By throwing in suited connectors with our premiums, we increase the frequency that we're making this play on them, and since it's such a big money maker, there's nothing wrong with doing it 3 times more often than we would be if we were only doing it for value. You know, we also have to balance our range so they can't know that we're only 3-betting them with aces and kings. And hey, we might even tilt. Also, we can call with some good but not great hands. Since lags are raising a ton of weak hands, like, you know, as light as 10-9 offsuit or ace-6 suited, crap like that, hands like queen-jack, queen-king, ace-10 are ahead of their range. And as long as we keep the pot small, it's fine to flat call with these hands in position. If we spike top pair, we can probably win a few barrels off them because they're so aggressive, and they'll assume that our calling means weakness because we're not raising them. But when getting involved with these marginal hands pre-flop, I gotta stress that you have to keep the pot really small. Do not let the pot get out of control, because if you're giving action with a hand that's easily dominated pre-flop, like big action, you're probably beat. But if you keep the pot small, you know, you're playing against a large enough percentage of their bluffing range versus their value range that you aren't, that I think overall you're profiting in the long run. And of course, simply folding to their opens to avoid variance is also a completely legitimate option. It's what I did for, you know, a full year, and I've made a lot of progress because I didn't have to deal with the stress of playing against loose aggressives. Lags love to put pressure on us with their stabbing bets, so to counter them we have to use leverage. I've talked about the idea of threatening the opponent's stack in the pot building lesson, and here is when it best comes into play. We'll have to do a fair bit of bluffing ourselves to keep lags in check, because we can't just fold to them every time they bet at us. But we don't want to be bluffing our entire stack just to keep them, you know, in check. So, for an example, say we were on the flop and the pot was $10, and we both have about 90 left in our stack. That's 3 bets left. We've got the initial 10, the re-raise to, you know, 25, 30, and then the all-in. So this would be a good spot. Say the board's like really dry, like King 7-2, the board that we know they're going to be continuation betting with their entire range, but only hit it with a small amount. This would be a good spot to bluff raise some percentage of the time. We put in the second bet, which would be about $30, which forces them to play back for the third bet, which in this example is their entire stack, if they want to continue. But we never have to risk the third bet, because if they come over the top and we don't have a made hand, we're throwing our hand away. But if we do have a made hand, we're calling and we're giving them action. But they won't know that whether or not we're planning on calling the third bet, and when we put in that second bet, we're leveraging them. We're making them risk their entire stack while only risking about half of ours. This way, we get a ton of fold equity against these guys because they're bluffing so much that they have air a lot and they have to fold to counter action. But we never have to risk our entire stack. To do this properly, you have to be aware of stack sizes, and you want to be putting in the bet that forces them to play for their stack rather than vice versa. It'll come with experience, trust me. Okay. I put this note a little too extreme here in the PowerPoint. But the idea is, if you call a bet from a leg, even if it's pre-flop, you got to be prepared to get barreled, because these guys are capable of triple barreling with nothing. They'll love to fire away, and if you have like top pair on the flop and you call because you think you probably have the best hand, and the turn and river don't change anything and you still have top pair, you're going to have to call a bet on the river, and you probably have to call a bet on the turn too, because these guys just are so aggressive that top pair is usually good against them in a pot control pot. Now, if there had been a raise, that changes things, but if it's just been bet call, bet call, bet call, the pot is relatively small and top pair is probably good. So, and until you show the ability to call them down to a showdown, they're going to just keep bluffing at you relentlessly. So at some point, you got to put your foot down, stand your ground, and just be like, hey, buddy, you can't push me around. Now, I still advocate folding early if you think you're beat, but you just can't, do the whole I'll call one time to keep them honest thing against this player type. If you're going to call the flop, get ready to be barreled, and don't give up just because the money gets big. If you think you have the best hand, call their bluffs down, and once you catch them once or maybe twice, they'll probably stop bluffing you so much, and it will be great for your meta game because they'll be a lot more honest with you, and it will be easier to play against them in the future. So going with that, use your pot control to the max against these guys. Lags love the threat of big bets. They go for check raises, over bets, whatever you can think of, anything to keep the pressure on, they're doing. So unless you have a hand that can stand heat, do a ton of checking to keep the pot small. The smaller you keep the pot, the less of an effect variance has when you guys are playing each other. And we want to make our variance big against weak opponents and keep our variance small against the tough opponents. So lags are the perfect people to exercise extreme pot control against. And remember, going to the first point, if you 3-bet before the flop and you get called, the pot's already very big. So there's nothing wrong with, checking 2 streets in a 3-bet pot if you have like top pair but marginal kicker. Like if you 3-bet ace jack and you flop the jack, there's nothing wrong with checking the river and putting your value bet in there just to make sure things don't get out of hand, because the lag's thinking, well, dry flop, I'm just going to check raise them all in because you probably can't call, and you don't want to get blown off a good hand. My closing advice for the day is to try to find games that aren't populated with loose aggressives. They're a real bitch to deal with, and it's hard to win a lot off them. If you can't avoid them, then I hope the advice I've given you is helpful, and I wish you the best in your poker conquest against these guys. This has been Grips for Grips.com. Take it easy, people.